Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. Today, we're going to be talking about the persecution and discrimination against Christians across Europe, how people are dealing with the lockdown there, and what we can learn about persecuted Christians during the time of the pandemic. That's coming right up. Stay with us. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and today I'm going to be talking to my friend Ellen Fantini of the Observatory for Discrimination and Intolerance against Christians in Europe. I actually met with her at the National Conservatism Conference last year in Washington, D.C., and then I met up to discuss a lot of these things with her in Vienna last fall after I attended the March for Life there. She works for an organization that takes a look at what's going on with Christians across Europe. Is discrimination increasing there? What is actually going on in regard to persecution? What is up with all of the arsons against churches in France, for example? And she joined me to discuss all of these things, as well as how she is coping with the lockdown in Europe and what this pandemic can teach us about persecuted Christians. Here's that conversation. First question, maybe introduce our listeners and our viewers to your work. When did you found this organization? What was the thinking behind it? And how have you really started to raise awareness about the subject of persecution in Europe?
Sure. Well, the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination against Christians in Europe was founded. I was not the founder. The founders began it about 10 years ago, and it was originally founded just as a project, not even as an observatory, but as a project to look at, to do a survey of Europe and find out what, if any, laws, either directly or indirectly, impact Christians in a negative way. And so that could be anything from not having conscientious objection protections for certain professions, all the way to, let's say, church registration laws. And so that whole range. And what they found was really shocking. There were, I think, 46 different laws across Europe that had a negative impact, either in their inception or in their application, negative impact against Christians. So having discovered that, they prepared a publication that outlined all of that, and that's available on our website in the publications section. I'll give you the website name later. As a result of that, and having done that research, they kept on running into incidents ranging from hate crimes against Christians, both individuals and Christian buildings, institutions, anything from vandalism to threats to physical violence against people. And then this kind of range of hostilities and marginalization that Christians experience. Right. And so some of them are legal, some of them are social marginalization. Certainly the questions that we've seen in the US and in Canada about Christian business owners and what they're able to do and not do in terms of saying yes or no to customers. And so as a result, the Observatory was founded to collect this information, to have a repository, because there is no other repository for pan-European information about Christians. And one of the reasons why we collect this information is because the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe every year collects hate crime data. Right. Hate crimes against any number of different groups, from anti-Semitism to xenophobia and racist biased violence. And there was nobody reporting on hate crimes against Christians. And although what we submit as a civil society organization is considered to be hate incidents, right? Because we're not the police, we're not a government, so it's not considered hate crimes. But they collect this information from us and from others, and it helps to provide a picture about what's going on in Europe. Of course, it's very hard to know whether what we're reporting is comprehensive. We like to say that we report the visible tip of the iceberg.
Right.
So we collect information based on media reports, based on eyewitness testimony. People send us incidents or photographs of vandalism that they've seen, and we do our best to investigate everything that we report, either by seeing if there's a credible media source that's reported it, perhaps triangulating the information if it doesn't seem complete enough for us. And we're very careful to be as cautious about our data as we can be, because our credibility is really on the line there. So we produce annual reports, both talking about the trends that we've seen, perhaps discussing a specific special issue if we see that it's emerging, and then we also provide all of the cases, a breakdown of all of the cases we've reported in that year.
So it's like taking a look at a few things here. When you say you try to at least help ensure that there is a more accurate picture of what's going on on the ground in Europe, there's a lot of, I think, among people who only read books on the hot button issues. So let's say Douglas Murray's The Strange Death of the West, or before that, it would be America Alone by Mark Stein. That gives part of the picture. It sort of pinpoints the strain that European society's been under due to the migrant crisis of 2015, and prior to that, because of immigration from other cultures. So you have cultures that mix together like oil and water, figuring out how to coexist with each other. From your perspective, with the research that your organization does, what does it look like on the ground in Europe, giving us a general picture? Right.
Well, so Christians in Europe were under a great deal of pressure before the, let's say, wave of migration in 2015, 2016. So even before that, Christians were under pressure, I would say, by, let's say, more of the secularist or anti-religious interest groups, whether they see Christianity as an organized religion that should be dismantled, whether they see Christianity and Christian institutions as representative of the patriarchy, or for the anarchists, perhaps a symbol of authority. So certainly the Christian church generally has been a lightning rod for any number of ideologies, and this was certainly true before we had an enormous influx of people from other cultures, particularly in people arriving from Muslim cultures, bringing their religion, but also, very interestingly, there are also a lot of Christian refugees who became Christian either as they were fleeing, before they fled, or upon arrival. Right. So converts from Islam to Christianity, and we dedicated one of our annual reports to this issue because it is so important. Because I think it's the closest we can come to what is the popular understanding of persecution, which is really that idea that a person might be killed or tortured. Right. And although there are accepted definitions of persecution that are much broader, so any negative treatment as a result of one's association with Christ or the church is a definition of persecution. We don't tend to use that at the Observatory because I think it's confusing for people who are very concerned with the plight of Christians outside Europe. So we try not to use that term to describe what's happening for Christians inside Europe. But so Christian refugees, we saw both their flight or their asylum claims, because in fact they were facing persecution, death for apostasy in the countries they were fleeing. once they got to Europe in the 2016 timeframe, they were put in accommodation homes with the same people from whom they were fleeing, in many ways. And so these culture clashes were then concentrated into very small spaces where everyone was under a lot of pressure, and Christians really were being persecuted here in Europe in these places, in the refugee homes that were supposed to be their safe havens. Mm-hmm. Additionally, a number of people converted once they arrived in Europe, and that was met with some skepticism from a lot of people who said, "Oh, isn't that convenient? Now they want to be Christians so that they won't be deported." But of course, anybody who understands the dynamics will understand that there is nothing convenient about being a Christian when you leave a religion as under a religion and religious tradition that understands conversion as apostasy, and that should be punished by death. So for these Christians, not only did they have to probably study Christianity and do Bible studies underground, hidden, hiding their Bibles, going to places, not showing their cross necklaces. Mm-hmm. So nothing convenient about either their conversion experience or what happened once they became a Christian. So we saw, in fact, in Vienna, Austria, where I'm based, the initiation rite for catechumens to enter the Catholic Church has gone from a public, joyful ceremony in the cathedral to an event that is joyful but not public. It's in a secret location. It's not in the cathedral. Only the priests, their catechumens, and their sponsors know where the event is, and only up until the day of the event does anybody know where it is.
Oh wow!
And this is in Vienna, Austria, and this is true. This is true all over Europe, because it's so dangerous. So from our perspective, it's very unlikely that there are a lot. Of course, there are bad apples everywhere. Mm-hmm. But so in fact, Open Doors commissioned a survey in Germany just last year. We reported it in October. 6,500 converts were surveyed to find out what their experience was like once they'd gotten here and had applied for asylum. And it turns out that it's a lottery. It's worse than a lottery, because government officials either don't believe that the conversion was genuine. And so this is when we've heard about using sort of Bible trivia or highly complex theological questions that I think even someone who is a Christian from birth might have trouble answering. Or even if they do believe that they're Christian, they don't believe that they face a genuine risk of persecution upon deportation. And so we've seen that in Germany, we've seen that in Sweden, we've seen that in Austria, we've seen that in the UK. And in fact, our most recent newsletter outlines the plight of one Christian convert who's about to be deported, and he's sure he will be killed if he's returned to Iran.
Yeah, and is it fair to say that they wouldn't be doing this if the person was a Shia being sent to a Sunni majority place or to a member of the Baha'i faith? Like, so often it seems that because Christianity, after it largely shifted from East to West, because it was considered to be a part of the original sin of the West, that the West is a lot more comfortable directing its criticism at Christians and dismissing Christian claims of persecution simply because they're trapped in this binary view of the oppressor and the oppressed. And to say that a Christian is being oppressed doesn't fit the worldview of most of those at the European Union, for example, in many government places. Because I've had that a lot. They're like, no, the Christians are the homophobic, transphobic. Like they're the people that we're trying to sort of do away with. They're the people that are making Hungary more authoritarian. They're the people trying to pass pro-life laws in Poland, right? They're not oppressed. They're the people that we're fighting, and so they can't actually escape this binary and understand that the sorts of people you're highlighting are at very real risk of being killed if they go back to their homeland.
Right. I think that's right, and to be honest, I mean, I think people are willing to understand the plight of a Christian refugee if you talk them through why they were fleeing.
Right.
So I mean, I think people are willing to accept that. I do think that you're correct that the concept of Christians as victims, let's say, really conflicts with the worldview of minority majority and the idea that anyone who may have been, I wouldn't say continues to be in some of these countries, but may have been a majority religion,
right?
That it's just inconceivable that they could be victimized in any way. And then you add in sort of these ideas of colonialism or power dynamics. And so you're right. People have a very hard time understanding that Christians can be victims of intolerance, discrimination, and persecution. But I also think, and this is not, I mean, some people are honest enough to articulate it, but I do think that there's a bit of an undercurrent of, well, maybe they had it coming. So in fact, it's been described, prejudice against Christians will end up being the last acceptable prejudice because of this idea that it's impossible to victimize a majority religion.
Well, it really struck me because I've been reading through your reports for some time now, and I noticed that what you highlight, the discrimination, like the full range directed against Christians, it comes from either the hyper-secularists, which you referred to earlier on in our conversation, right? So this would be a lot of the sort of the 60s revolutionaries types and their ideological descendants at this point. These are the people, right, who are trying to shut down, a little old lady who sells flowers because she doesn't want to create an arrangement that celebrates a relationship she morally disapproves of, for example.
Right.
Or saying that somebody who refuses to use sort of recently invented transgender pronouns because he or she objects to compelled speech, that person now has to face the full brunt of either social disapproval or, in some cases, the law. And then on the other hand, and I know people who have personally experienced this, right? There's women who get called horrible names by Muslim migrants or immigrants or refugees because of how they're dressed, because they're not wearing a headscarf, for example. And it seems if you read the two types of reports that you folks often publish, you have the secularist radicals, and then you have these people coming from other cultures who are in many cases they think that the way they're behaving is normal because that's how they would have behaved back in their country, rather than the idea that they're intentionally doing something. It seems that the situation in Europe involves Christians sort of being trapped in these pincers between those who are coming in to replace their culture and the secularists who own the countries. You mentioned that the minority majority idea doesn't work anymore. I believe it's Italy right now that has the highest number of Christians who go to church at least once a month, and they don't even approach a quarter of the population. Right? In Canada, 89% of Canadians don't attend worship services regularly, and that's any religion. Right? So Christians are a minority, but it seems that they sort of are getting squeezed by the people that are coming in and replacing what was once a Christian culture, and then from the top down by those who have been doing away with the Christian culture for a half century. What do you make of that?
Right. No, I think that's right, and I think imagining pressure coming from two sides that would otherwise probably not really have that much in common,
right?
But when you have, let's say, a common target, then it's made, let's say, strange bedfellows in the sense that that the secularists, and for lack of a better term, because I think it is important to say that the majority of Muslims in Europe have no interest in persecuting Christians. They just want to live their lives.
For sure.
But I would say, particularly when it comes to Muslim background Christians, Muslim background converts, that microcosm of pressure in a neighborhood or in a society really is too much for many of them to handle, and they really have to flee. And that's true. That's true in Europe, and that's true in their countries of origin. But this idea that you have Islamist activists, let's call it that, and then the hyper secularists, kind of cheering each other on. Maybe not explicitly always, but this idea that, well, the Christians had it coming, or the churches have been in power for far too long, and I think that's a serious problem because of course Europe and the European countries really do have backgrounds of freedom. They have constitutions that support freedom. Not exactly in the same way as constitutions in North America, but for example, when we think about, we'll talk about very current events, which is that everybody's on lockdown in Europe,
mm-hmm.
and church services in most countries in Europe at this point are prohibited either by the religious, let's say, orders themselves, or by the government, or by saying, well, more than 10 people can't be gathered together in a room. More than 10 people can be together in a supermarket, but so Christians don't even have the refuge of a church service these days here in Europe, and I'll be interested to see whether that strengthens Christians' faith, whether they grow hungry for it, or whether they say, I guess it's not that bad. I think that'll be very interesting. I would also be very interested in seeing if there are going to be any constitutional challenges, legal challenges to these laws, saying, look, the Constitution allows for freedom of association and religious expression, religious freedom. If you keep us from our worship services, whether that's in a mosque, a synagogue, or a church building, that's a violation of our constitutional rights and our rights as Europeans.
That point is being made by almost nobody except for, I believe, Peter Hitchens over at the Mail on Sunday. I have to say, I was mildly amused reading his comments opposing these, because it said Peter Hitchens is the sort of guy who says the world is ending until everybody else says it, and then he's like, come on, it's not that bad. Right. I think this is why he gets called a contrarian. But it's sort of interesting in this time, and I'll fire this question at you, and you can deflect it if you'd like. But I'm just sort of curious, what do you think happens to the strange alliance between radical secularists and then the Islamist activists, using your phraseology, when the Christianity vanishes to the point where it's not a target worth going after? So I'll give you an example, a recent example that prompts this question. In the UK, it's primarily now Muslim immigrants who are opposing LGBT education, and specifically, like, this education is boiling all the way down to explaining to kids that gender isn't a real thing; it's a social construct, etc. It's both not a real thing, and you can choose your own. Go figure. But it's interesting that the media doesn't really know what to do with these imams and these parents, because these imams and these parents are coming forward and they're saying exactly what I would say if it was my kid in school. I agree with virtually every word coming out of their mouth. But you haven't yet seen common cause between Muslim parents and Christian parents, partially because this is the UK and the Church of England was colonized a long time ago. But you also don't have the media throwing the same rhetorical bombs at the Muslims that they would have at the Christians, right? Suddenly, homophobe and transphobe is not being bandied about quite so enthusiastically. They're very careful about how they word it, because they know if they say, well, they just don't understand yet, they sound patronizing, and that's racist. But if they call them a transphobe, then they're going to be ignoring the diversity of opinion and the beauty of multiculturalism. And so I'm just interested to know what you think happens next, because the Christians in places like the UK are such a minority that they're more or less sidelined. There's the group Christian Concern, which puts out some good stuff, but they don't have the clout or the numbers that some of the Islamic leaders do. So what happens when the target in between the secularists and the Islamic activists are gone, and they're just facing each other with all of the baggage they've accumulated over the last 25 years?
Well, I think the example you gave is perfect. So the parents in Birmingham with their signs saying the same thing that conservative Christian families would hold up, but for the media in particular, but also just for the person on the street, the optics don't make sense because they ruin the narrative. They ruin the narrative in the sense that it's only the conservative Christians who are really off the wall and hate human rights and so on and so on. That's the narrative. So what do you do when you see these Muslim families saying, we want better for our kids, and you don't get to decide how we parent them, and you don't get to decide what kind of sexual education, relationships education they get, and we're not going to stand for this.
And they're accusing them of ideological colonization on top of it, which to somebody like myself watching this is just it's a rather beautiful irony to watch that because it's both true and it's exactly the sort of thing that the left is very sensitive about.
Right. And there have been examples in some of these towns. I mean, to be honest, a lot of times there are neighborhoods or suburbs or even whole cities that tend to have Muslim majority or Christian majority. And so you don't end up seeing a lot of Muslim parents and Christian parents. Right. And by the way, also Jewish parents who all believe the same thing.
That's right. The rabbis spoke out as well.
Exactly. And so I mean, these are opportunities to talk. I mean, everyone wants to talk about interreligious dialogue, except if it's a Christian clergyman, a rabbi, and an imam all saying, don't put this ideology on our children. And then people don't want to hear those united voices. So, I mean, I think that those are where the real opportunities are. And I think the left says, well, we'll put up with it because, well, in the end, it's their culture, but they just don't understand why a Christian would feel the same way. And frankly, I think because the number of Jewish believers and communities in Europe is fairly small, that's a minority voice that's strong on some of these issues, but doesn't have the same kind of power. So yes, I agree with you that this is where people get very confused.
So I want to take a look at a few things that get heard, like we hear a lot about in North America, and I'd like your perspective on them because this is the sort of thing that you study. So first, we hear a lot about the sort of kidnappings in Norway, the over-enthusiastic child services taking kids away from their parents, and we hear a lot that there's a religious element to this. We had actually on this podcast the mother of the 3 children who were taken away last year and who's currently fighting to get them back. And I wanted to know what your perspective, living in Europe and following these things closely, is there a religious element to what's going on in Scandinavia, or is this just an over-enthusiastic government agency? We know it's a tragedy either way, but I'd like to know what you think about the religious aspect of all of this.
Yeah, I think it's very clear in some of those cases in Norway, even if it's not an explicit reason why children might be vulnerable for social services to take them away, there is kind of an undercurrent especially when the families are Christian. There's an undercurrent of, well, maybe they're too strict with their children. Maybe they're teaching them things that we as Norwegians think shouldn't be taught. And so, although in some cases, it was fairly explicit. I think it's more an undercurrent, a bias, a prejudice. It certainly doesn't go in the family's favor if they are
Right.
conservative Christian family. That's for sure. And I think also across Europe, we see, for lack of a better way to describe it, an illiteracy when it comes to religion and faith generally, especially in Scandinavia, but really across Europe. And so this is the same reason why government officials do Bible trivia rather than understanding someone's conversion experience. This is why when a parent is Christian and chooses to homeschool, why they're the target of government interference, where, let's say, if they had a different ideology that led them to want to homeschool, they probably would be kind of ignored or allowed to do that. So I think that there is this religious illiteracy or lack of understanding of what faith means, and that it doesn't start and stop on maybe on a holiday or a Sunday morning, but rather is integrated into a person's life and a family's life, and informs the choices they make, how they make decisions for their family about a whole wide range of topics.
Right.
And governments and bureaucrats don't seem to understand that very well. I think that's a problem.
That leads me into the second thing I was going to ask about, especially because homeschooling is such an enormous movement in the United States. It's over 3 million strong. And so we've all heard the stories about what happened to homeschoolers in Germany, for example. But I know this is one of the things your organization has looked at. So what is the state of parental rights, especially as it pertains to Christians in Europe?
Well, yeah, I mean, the homeschooling regulations and laws vary from country to country, and I would say also vary from for how they're enforced. So there might be countries that say homeschooling's allowed. For example, Austria.
Right.
Homeschooling is allowed, but the child must then have tests in German. So if you're an American family or a Canadian family or any family that doesn't speak German, doesn't teach their children in German because you're trying to keep their maybe native language, or maybe they're here temporarily, then it's illegal. So then people face fines for homeschooling their children if the children can't pass these tests in German. I think in North America, in the US in particular, homeschooling really underwent a cultural shift, and in its beginnings really weren't because of religion, but rather, in fact, saying a rejection of the conventional education system in the U.S. Right. And so it was an interesting mix of, let's say, kind of back to the land leftists joining up with traditionalist Christian families, and saying, okay, we can agree to this, which is that decisions about a child's upbringing, including education, starts with the family, that the family is, in fact, the first educators, and that they should be able to make decisions for their own families about what's best for their kids. And so I think in the U.S., they found a way to work together that was very, very effective. And it doesn't mean that they're running book clubs together, but it means that they're sticking up for one another and the family's rights. I think that in Europe, nearly across the board, there isn't that same, let's say, activist culture, perhaps. And so a lot of times I think families, maybe they band together with some of their neighbors, maybe some of the people they go to church with, and they form these small alliances, but it's not as common to have these larger ideological alliances that really have a grassroots effect on some of these issues.
Right.
Yeah.
Looking at what I want to pull on something you said earlier that really did strike me. The idea that the majority in Europe no longer understand Christians, which is, I think, something that very few people. I talked about this with my last guest as well, because in Canada, the number of people who've actually read the Bible is below 10%. Right. So when we're talking about things like conscience rights, like, people need to understand what the word conscience means before they can understand what conscience rights are. But I'm thinking of an example a year and a half ago in the Netherlands, when the Nashville Statement, a number of Reformed pastors signed a statement basically upholding the basic biblical definition of marriage, and the whole country blew up for like a week. And there was ministers getting like death threats. And there was a lot of articles in mainstream newspapers where LGBT activists just said, we are surprised to know that there are still people who think this, right? They knew there was big churches that were packed with people. They knew that there was a Bible Belt in the Netherlands, but they'd almost coexisted and ignored their existence to the point that they were stunned to find out people still thought the thing that everybody in the Netherlands had believed for the previous, 50 years back and then 1,000 years before, right?
Right.
So this is what all of Europe believed for 2,000 years in one form or another. And every religious war would have involved two groups of people who agreed on marriage. And now we've got 2 generations out from that. They don't even understand what does that contribute to what you see happening, this lack of understanding of what Christianity even is or means?
Well, right. Yeah. I think when people don't understand what it means to have this deeply held belief, and even that phrase, deeply held belief, I think people don't really understand what that means, and that a deeply held religious belief, a moral belief, is something that someone is willing to suffer for,
right? Because
they will not violate it. And I think more and more, especially younger people, they just don't understand how you could be so committed to something that you'd be willing to suffer lawsuits, you'd be willing to suffer persecution, you'd be willing to suffer death in some cases. So I think you're right, but I also think it's this cynical idea, and really it is cynicism fueled by the media, that anytime someone invokes religious belief, deeply held moral or religious philosophical belief about something, the cynicism that really it's just an excuse to discriminate against others, or to restrict reproductive rights. So, for example, in our most recent newsletter, we posted about a United Nations report that was ostensibly to address gender-based violence and discrimination in the name of religion or belief. Right. So the findings were that there are religions that in the name of the tenets of that religion end up discriminating against women, and therefore they are discriminatory. And of course, we can imagine that Christianity was the biggest target. And so the rapporteur, this is the person who wrote the report, criticized religious beliefs and the obligations that go along with those beliefs, such as the availability of reproductive medicine, is how the rapporteur would put it. So the rapporteur says, in some countries around the world, governments maintain partial or total bans on abortion, and religious figures in these countries have encouraged these measures. Well, right. So if, I'll give an example. If the Catholic Church says abortion is a moral evil that must be prevented, and you have a government or voters who believe that's true, then yes, they're going to vote with their conscience. So the special rapporteur for the United Nations says, look, abortion should be legal, it's healthcare for women, and if it's not, well, then these bigots are standing in the way of women's reproductive rights, and they shouldn't be able to use religion as an excuse. And I mean, that just shows how the illiteracy about what it means to have these deeply held beliefs
breeds
it
bigotry
informs
of their own.
everything. Exactly. And then if we talk about questioning gender ideology and whether that's good for kids or good for families or good for society, the rapporteur says, look, gender ideology is real. It's not pseudoscience. And if you question it, then you're just discriminating against people. So again, if you don't buy what people are selling, then you're a bigot and you're discriminating against women. And in fact, the argument is that you're contributing to the violence women experience, which is outrageous, of course.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to take a quick look at was, I know that you're hesitant in using the word persecution, and the reason for that, of course, is because you see what's going on in North Korea, where people can be executed for having a Bible, right? What happened in ISIS recently, and thank God that they've been largely eliminated, but what they were doing with Christians. I saw your screen emoticon when we started our interview was the N for the Nazarene that ISIS was painted on Christian doorways. But at the same time, I saw a couple of months ago a report about the number of French churches that were being burned down, for example. So to what extent does this discrimination move from the sorts of laws that we're talking about and sorts of attitudes that we're talking about on behalf of sort of the managerial elites and the people that are running the international institutions like the UN and the EU? And to what point does it like spill over into vandalism, burning down churches, and actual physical violence?
Right. So the phenomenon of the vandalism of French churches that we reported last year, when there happened to be an enormous influx of them right before the fire at Notre Dame, which we have no reason to think was anything other than a tragic fire, by the way, because lots of people asked me about that because of the timing. And I have no reason. I certainly don't have any more evidence than anybody else does.
Right. Yeah, that was my instinct too when I heard it burned down. Was just okay, another one, right?
Right. So France in particular seems to be suffering from intentional vandalism of its churches, not just vandalism, but really egregious fires, destruction and theft of sacred objects, things that are sacred to Christians, consecrated hosts from Catholic churches being stolen, destroyed, thrown away, really going far beyond the idea of these are teenagers, these are bored teenagers, these are pranks. Isn't it funny to try to steal something? Isn't it? Or maybe people trying to steal coins from an offertory box. What we're seeing is far beyond that. There's an anger. There's something really directed at the heart of the expression of Christian faith that seems to be the target of these incidents. And we see this in France. We're seeing it in Spain. We see it across Europe, but really in France, it's the toughest situation right now, I would say. And perhaps it's very hard to diagnose the reason why, but I would say that France also tends to have those two forces that both have Christian institutions in their sights for very different reasons. And so a radicalized Islamist sees a church as a symbol of the West, of Christians generally, and makes it a target. From the other side, let's call it from the radicalized left, then, as I said at the very beginning of our conversation, churches and church buildings are the lightning rod for whatever your ideology is.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any idea? So these churches are being burned down by both sides, by one side, or do we simply not know who most of the culprits are?
Well, I'll back you up a little bit and say that I wouldn't say churches being burnt down, because that really does make it sound like there are hundreds of churches literally being burnt to the ground,
right,
to cinders.
Set
I
on
would
fire.
say that set on fire. I think that's a more responsible way to describe it. There are certainly churches that have been intentionally burnt to the ground in Europe, but I would say the majority are intentionally set fires that cause a great deal of damage, but are stop short of complete destruction of the building. So anyway, making that little distinction, I would say the destruction just. It seems to be really rage-filled. It really seems to be motivated by something more than mischief, but really anger. And I think it's also, hate crimes are generally described as message crimes, right? So you're both trying to destroy something, but you're also trying to send a message. And if the message is, you're not safe in your church, even this building isn't safe, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to secure it. You're going to have to get security cameras. You're going to have to get guards, but you're not safe. You as Christians are not safe. That's the message of these kinds of incidents. And to be honest, I think in some places it's working.
Before I get to what Vienna's like under lockdown, I guess my final question on all of this is, where do you see this all going? From what we've seen, from the data I've looked at in the last 6 months, it seems like year over year, the decline of Christianity is more or less complete. And what I mean by more or less complete is that you've seen all the people who used to identify as Christian but no longer do slowly sort of trickle away. And so what you're left with in most countries is sort of a rump. And the idea of it declining further than that, I think, is greatly exaggerated. So I think it's fair to say that in virtually every European country, you have a Christian minority, a very small one in most of the countries that we've talked about. The debate on migration, immigration, refugees goes on, but it seems likely that immigration will consistently be necessary as long as Europeans themselves aren't replacing the population at all. And of course, secularism isn't going to burn out anytime soon, unless, of course, well, who knows what the world will look like 6 months from now. So I'll add that proviso to everything I just said. There's a lot of things we didn't think would be happening, but who knows? But what do you see the landscape looking like going forward, as you look at all the data that you've been collecting? I know that both yourself and your husband are keen analysts of European culture, of different the different directions some political movements are taking, even. So you bring that to the table. Setting aside for a moment what the world might look like after the coronavirus pandemic and the changes that might bring, where do you see this headed overall?
Well, I think I'm a slightly more optimistic than you are in some ways, and it's funny to be in that position because I'm constantly gathering this information, and really there's more there than our organization could ever really collect, without having an army of people on the ground investigating everything. So on the one hand, one might assume that I'm naturally and understandably pessimistic, but I'll say that there are glimmers of hope, and I do think that society may just get to a tipping point where they say, enough. This is absurd. Of course, parents can raise their children how they want to. It is absurd that our patrimony and these glorious temples of our heritage, whether we're Christian or not, should not continue to be destroyed. I think people, Christian families and others, are starting to say, stop. So for example, in France, where you have a very heavily secular society by design, laïcité is by design a way to make sure that society respects the governmental secularism. Tens of thousands of families joining demonstrations and manifestations relating to expansion of reproductive technologies, beyond married couples, this Manif pour tout, and other, let's say, movements that are really grassroots. I think that they're having some success and really a groundswell because people have just said, okay, enough. This is absurd. This is absurd that we can't stop teachers from using a different pronoun than the one we use at home for our 6-year-old. Enough. As the Italians might say, basta. Yeah, enough. So although I'm very concerned about the level of violence in these incidents, both against human beings and Christian buildings, I also see opportunities for hope and for activism, not just for Christians, but for Europeans generally, who say religion is a good in society. Even if I'm not a believer, it makes us all more civilized, and that's a good for our culture. So I have some hope, but of course, we'll check back together in 6 months and see how we did.
Well, I know who you're referring to. There is increasingly a large number of secularists who are saying, without Christianity, our society does not have the foundation necessary to respect human rights. Like, so we got, Douglas Murray, who calls himself a Christian atheist. Roger Scruton, before his death, had gone back to church, even though he wasn't sure about the historicity of things like the resurrection. You've got Tom Holland, who just produced that book, Dominion, in which he makes the historical case for why Christianity is necessary for human rights to be respected. And then, and I will admit that there was a bit of schadenfreude here, you have Richard Dawkins coming out and saying maybe we should not get rid of Christianity as fast as I thought we should have because we don't know what's going to replace it once it's gone. So I do see what you're saying there. And my natural pessimism, which I have to admit has been groomed by the reports that I get from your organization. There is still people that are saying things. I guess if you had told me 10 years ago that Dawkins would be saying maybe we shouldn't get rid of Christianity, I would have said, wow, that's a really hopeful sign. So that's a fair enough reminder. What are things like in Vienna right now on the ground? We're under lockdown in Canada. All 9 provinces have declared a state of emergency. The news from the U.S. changes daily, but as we know, New York is the epicenter there. What are things like for you in Vienna?
Well, so Vienna, I will say we imposed our own sort of lockdown, meaning in my family, a few days before the government did. And the government initially started, like many, with let's say social cool down in the sense of, okay, only groups of 10, keep your social distance. Okay, now only groups of 5, and then they finally said, look, stay at home. Stay safe, stay at home, just like in the United States, with of course the exceptions for certain essential services. And my understanding was that there was a press conference today with Sebastian Kurz, and that he added some more restrictive measures. I haven't briefed myself on those, but I would say the streets are very quiet. People really are using social pressure, at least in social media, to remind one another that we have to do this, that this is how we stay safe. There are a limited number of ventilators in Austria, although I think that there are more coming. But just like any place, I mean, it's worth thinking of Austria as a province or a state, in the sense that it's a small country, right? And is doing a very good job, I think, of addressing this as quickly as possible, closing borders where it needed to, and of course, it's under heavy criticism because of the problems in the Tyrol, where there was a concentration of infections, especially relating to a ski area, and that region. There were a couple of regions that were completely quarantined, meaning this is not social distancing. This is quarantine. You can't go anywhere. Right. Nobody in or out. So in fact, on Saturday, I was outside on the balcony, and I heard a sound that I hadn't heard in a couple of weeks, and that was the sound of a plane going overhead. And there's a flight pattern over our apartment building that we've grown accustomed to. And so it was very strange. I imagine it was either a repatriation flight for Austrian citizens abroad, which they've done a very good job. The foreign ministry has done a very, very good job of arranging repatriation for any Austrians who want to come home. Otherwise, they'll have to shelter in place where they are. But I also think that there are some deliveries of goods and medicine or equipment. I mean, so it's pretty quiet around here. It's certainly it's a good time to do our work, but also reflect on what we're missing by not being able to go to church, and thinking about our persecuted brothers and sisters all around the world for whom going to church has right. been either non-existent or a luxury that they've been willing to die for. So, that's a good perspective as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. Final question before I let you go: where
yes.
can our listeners find your work?
So we have a website, www.intoleranceagainstchristians.eu. And from there, you can see the cases that we report. You can see news stories that might be interesting. There's also a publication section where you can see reports from previous years, as well as books that have been written, partner organizations. And then we also have a Facebook page. That's OIDAC Europe. And we also have the same on Twitter. And we try to use our social media pages not just to sort of publicize the cases that we have collected, but also to bring out maybe larger issues around the world, right. social issues that might be of interest to our readers.
Well, Ellen, thank you so much for taking the time.
Sorry, one more thing. You can sign up for your very own newsletter. There's a sign up section on our website as well as on the Facebook page. So you can sign up to receive our newsletter.
Which I do recommend to everybody. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us about this.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with Ellen Fantini of the Observatory for Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. Thanks so much for joining us. If you want to check out past shows, head over to lifesitenews.com. Click on the podcast button. You'll find all of my past shows there. You can listen to this podcast on any of the podcast platforms that you use. And if you want to check out other daily news updates on important culture war issues happening around the world, head over to lifesitenews.com. And there is more than enough to keep you busy there. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope you and your family are staying safe.